The order came just before dusk, carried on a voice so dry it almost blended with the desert wind. "Shed your clothes." The women froze. The arid air of the Nevada rail camp clung to their skin like a shroud of dust. Wagon wheels creaked, ropes strained, and somewhere in the distance, a mule brayed. But on this patch of cracked earth, 50 captured Chinese women, survivors of a raid on a rival railroad camp, felt time stop. They had heard stories of the Cowboys, of their casual cruelty and vengeful ways. Now it felt like their turn had come. One woman whispered in Cantonese, "So this is how we perish." The guards, men with sun-cracked faces and dusty hats, didn't respond. They just waited, boots shifting on the gravel. A hawk cried overhead. The smell of sagebrush, horse sweat, and fear mixed into something acrid. Most of the women had been marched for a full day, their simple cotton tunics stained with dirt and the blood of others. When the order came, it wasn't shouted. It was announced, procedural, almost rehearsed. That made it worse. In that stillness, a second voice broke through. A younger man's drawl, calm and steady. "We're checking for fever and lice. Can't have sickness spreading through the camp. No harm will come to you." But the words didn't fit the moment. A cowboy explaining himself. Impossible. The women hesitated. The guards waited longer. Sweat carved clean lines through the dust on their necks. No one moved first. Then one woman, a former herbalist named Mai, stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she untied the sash of her tunic. The others followed, shame burning hotter than the desert sun. Behind them, 2 men unfolded coarse wool blankets. Not ropes, not rifles, blankets. The shock hit harder than any bullet. One of the cowboys, a man with weary eyes, turned his face away as he handed Mai a blanket. She had expected disgust or cruelty, but saw embarrassment. That flicker of decency cracked something inside her. This wasn't how barbarians behaved. As they washed in the cold creek water, she noticed the guards keeping their distance, hats tipped low, as if acknowledging, not dominating the prisoners. The air felt different now, not safe, but strange, too civilized for this harsh land. When the washing ended, no one spoke. The women stood in stunned silence, still clutching their blankets, unsure whether to thank their captors or fear what came next. But before they could decide, another voice called out, "Proceed to the barn for further checks." The next step would show them what this strange mercy truly meant. The women entered a large barn that smelled of hay, carbolic soap, and dry wood. Lanterns flickered against the rough-hewn walls, and for the first time since their capture, they were out of the relentless sun. Mai clutched her blanket tighter, her heart beat louder than the shuffle of bare feet on the dirt floor. She expected more humiliation, maybe interrogation, maybe worse. Instead, a man in a faded denim jacket stepped forward, a ledger in hand, his eyes tired but steady. "Name?" he asked softly. No bark, no sneer, just procedure. Behind him, 2 other men laid out rags, a bucket of pungent salve, and a jug of whiskey. The women exchanged confused glances. One whispered, "They're tending to our wounds." The man, the foreman Cole, didn't look at their faces as he worked. He checked for the telltale flush of fever with the back of his hand, looked for sores, and dabbed the worst of the cuts with whiskey-soaked rags. When he reached Mai, he paused. Her hands were trembling uncontrollably. "You're safe here," he murmured, though he knew the words would mean little. Outside, the noise of horses and men's voices bled through the barn doors. The brutal world of the West still roared beyond this small, strange island of decency. But inside, something fragile was forming, a truce that no railroad baron had ordered. Mai couldn't stop watching him, not because he was kind, but because he seemed burdened by that kindness, as if decency itself was a dangerous weight to carry in this land. She noticed how he turned his head away each time a woman reached for a blanket. No smirks, no lingering eyes, just discomfort, the kind that comes from empathy. Later, the women were led to a wash basin with heated water and actual soap. Their reflections in the steel basin made them flinch, filthy, thin, unrecognizable, but alive. And no one shouted at them. No one struck them. Back at our camp, My whispered to the woman beside her. The foreman would have left us to rot if we got sick. The woman didn't reply. She just nodded slowly, her eyes filling with something that wasn't quite tears. Maybe confusion, maybe guilt. By the time the inspection ended, the women were quiet, wrapped in clean, dry blankets. The guards carried their old clothes away to be burned. Outside, the setting sun threw long shadows over the makeshift camp. For the first time, I realized these men didn't hate them. They pitied them. But pity, she would soon learn, could be more disarming than hate. By morning, the camp smelled of beef stew. Not gunpowder or sweat. Stew. Steam curled from a large iron pot over an open fire as the cowboys moved between the tents, handing out tin bowls. The Chinese women hesitated again. Every scent screamed trap. Their last warm meal had been days ago, served by their own people before the raid. Since then, food had meant survival of the fittest, hiding scraps, bargaining, enduring. Now the enemy offered soup. I watched a young cowboy ladle brownish liquid into her bowl. He didn't speak her language, but he smiled awkwardly, gesturing for her to eat. She waited for others to taste it first. No one fell ill. The smell, the meat, onions, and corn, was too real to resist. When she finally raised the spoon, the warmth hit like a shock. It wasn't just food, it was proof that something she believed about these men was wrong. Nearby, a guard offered cornbread. Real cornbread, golden and still warm from a skillet. I took a piece and stared at it like it was a relic. "They feed us better than our own foreman did," whispered one woman. The guard didn't react. He probably didn't understand, but the line stayed in the air like a confession. Across the frontier, stories told of the brutality of railroad work camps, where life was cheap and survival rates were grim. Yet here, every sip of stew felt like defiance against those odds. I tried to keep her face blank. She didn't want them to see gratitude. But when the same cowboy refilled her bowl without being asked, her control cracked. "Why?" she muttered, half to herself. He shrugged, pointing to the faded brand on a nearby supply crate, a simple cross inside a circle. "Company rules," he seemed to say with a gesture. Not mercy, rules are somehow. That made it even harder to process. Later, when the bowls were collected, I caught her reflection in the pot sheen, her eyes swollen but alive. Around her, women whispered prayers they hadn't said since they left their homeland. For the first time since their capture, they weren't thinking about death. They were thinking about tomorrow. But that small comfort would soon be tested. Because the next order from the camp foreman would drag them back into fear, one that looked at first like friendship. By the third day, the shock had turned into a strange kind of routine. Wake up, line up, eat, wash. But nothing felt real. The hastily built stockade fence glinted in the morning sun. Guards patrolled with rifles, but they sometimes nodded a greeting. I couldn't understand this world where captors handed a pouch of tobacco to their prisoners. It went against everything she'd been taught about honor, the enemy, and shame. Near the fence, a lanky cowboy flicked a match into life and gestured toward the group. "Smoke," he offered in slow, broken English. A few women turned away, suspicious, but one reached out a trembling hand. When the first puff of harsh tobacco hit her lungs, she coughed, then laughed. A dry, stunned laugh that spread through the group like static. Within minutes, the fence line looked like a strange gathering after a long journey. Prisoners sitting cross-legged, sharing hand-rolled cigarettes, whispering. It wasn't comfort, it was confusion. Their experience had painted the cowboys as monsters. Yet here was a man who apologized when he accidentally brushed a prisoner's arm. I noted the detail like a scholar cataloging an impossible specimen. Behind her, the foreman, Cole, watched silently. He kept the routine strict, meals on time, roll calls precise, yet beneath the discipline, there was an undercurrent of respect. "They treat us like people," one woman muttered, half in disbelief. That evening, I was summoned to assist in the supply tent. She had once been a healer. They needed help sorting medicinal herbs. Inside, she saw crates stamped with the mark of a major Eastern supplier, clean bandages, laudanum, quinine. She'd never seen such abundance. The railroad camps she knew ran on scraps and folk remedies. The victory of capital and industry was visible in every gauze roll and tin cup. When her work was done, the same lanky cowboy from the fence handed her a cigarette. She hesitated. "Why?" she asked in her limited English. He exhaled smoke and grinned a tired grin. "Because you look like you need one." That night, Mai couldn't sleep. She wrote something on a scrap of wrapping paper. Just one line, folded carefully and tucked into her bedding. "The enemy is not what we were told, but by morning, that note would disappear, taken during a search and never seen again." The note Mai had written was gone by sunrise. The guards had searched the sleeping quarters at dawn, routine, efficient, emotionless. Every scrap of paper was confiscated, every folded corner flattened by foreign hands. When the search ended, Mai's blanket felt lighter, as if a piece of her had been taken with it. Around her, murmurs spread, small drawings, characters practiced on wood chips, even pressed desert flowers, all gone. That afternoon, a rider announced the new rule. No personal writings permitted until review by the foreman. The announcement echoed through the yard. Some women lowered their heads. Others stared blankly at the ground. They weren't angry, just hollow. For them, words were the only escape. Mai couldn't let it end there. That night, under the dim lantern light, she began writing again, this time on the back of a label from a medicine bottle. "To whoever finds this," she began, her brushstrokes careful. "I was taught that capture erased honor. But here I see men who show more honor than those who taught me." Her hand trembled, but the words felt alive. By the end of the week, dozens of such notes circulated secretly among the women. They weren't messages home, they were quiet confessions, some apologizing to the dead, others describing small mercies. Years later, historians would find that a handful of such frontier testimony survived, saved by missionaries or the occasional sympathetic official. Most were simply lost to the dust. One evening, as Mai folded her note, a familiar voice interrupted. The foreman, Cole, stood in the doorway. He didn't raise his rifle. He simply said, "You shouldn't risk this." His tone wasn't threatening, it was weary, almost protective. She met his eyes and asked softly, "Why do you care?" He didn't answer. He just took the paper, hesitated, and slipped it into his pocket. Days passed. Rumors spread that some guards were keeping the notes, not for intelligence, but because they couldn't bring themselves to destroy them. Human words, written by the enemy, were harder to burn than orders. Mai never saw her note again. But weeks later, she noticed the foreman carried something folded inside his jacket pocket, always pressed close. She never asked if it was hers. She didn't need to. That letter, sealed in silence, would soon decide both their fates, though neither could imagine how. Cole sat on the edge of his cot, the camp muffled in post-sundown silence. Outside, the desert hummed with crickets and distant coyotes, but his focus was on a folded piece of paper resting in his palm. The note. Her characters were neat, deliberate, shaped by a discipline he couldn't comprehend. He had confiscated dozens of scraps before, all burned per the company man's protocol. But this one he'd kept. He told himself it was for documentation. He knew that was a lie. He unfolded it again. The ink was simple, made from charcoal and water, but the words remained clear. "They treat us with a respect we do not deserve." Perhaps that is their strength. Cole read it twice, 3 times. He'd seen his share of desperate people, bandits, homesteaders, rival crews, but never anyone who mirrored his own doubts back at him. Every man on the frontier had a coping rule: don't think too much. But after months on this job, the walls between duty and empathy were wearing thin. The railroad bosses didn't warn you about that. They taught you how to keep order, not how to stay human. The next morning, during roll call, Cole caught Mai's eye for a moment longer than he should have. She bowed slightly, a gesture of quiet understanding, not defiance. That single moment would have gone unnoticed if another cowboy, a hard-faced man named Riggs, hadn't been watching. By midday, rumors crawled through the camp. Cole's gone soft. He's protecting one of them. It wasn't true, but truth mattered less than perception in the wild. That night, Riggs confronted him. "Keep your distance, Cole," he warned, spitting tobacco juice near Cole's boots. "We ain't here to make friends." Cole nodded, jaw tight. Understood, but his mind replayed the words from her note again and again. He returned to his post, the folded paper still in his pocket. The wooden stockade gleamed in the moonlight. Mai stood near the fence, silent. Their eyes met briefly, two prisoners of circumstance, divided by rules neither believed in anymore. Behind them, whispers grew. The camp was changing. Kindness had become suspect. The very humanity that had once shocked the prisoners was now turning against the men who showed it, and before long, the whispers would become orders. By the end of that week, the camp felt colder, though the desert heat hadn't changed. The men spoke less, smoked more. The easy banter that once drifted between them was replaced by murmurs. "You hear about Cole," someone whispered in the mess tent. "Reads their little pictures, talks to them like people." A few laughed, others didn't. Out here, mercy was dangerous. It blurred the line that made survival possible. Rumors spread fast in isolation. The cook claimed Cole gave extra stew to a Chinese woman. Another man swore he saw him pass something folded through the fence. None of it could be proven, but in the machinery of frontier gossip, proof wasn't needed. By the third retelling, Cole wasn't just a lenient foreman. He was a sympathizer. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very decency they were ordered to show, the company rules, the basic rations, was now being twisted into suspicion. One cowboy muttered, "You treat them soft, they'll slip a knife in your back." Another replied, "She looks harmless till her whole clan shows up." It didn't matter that there hadn't been a single escape attempt. Fear was the air they breathed. Mai noticed the change, too. The shared tobacco stopped. The awkward smiles vanished. The guards looked through the prisoners, not at them. The small world of civility they'd built was cracking. One afternoon, during laundry duty, Mai overheard two cowboys arguing outside the supply shed. "You really think those women are just laundresses?" one said. "Spies for the Central Pacific Line, more like. They know routes, water sources. Bet half of them are men dressed up." The other shrugged. "Maybe. But they're beaten now." Leave it be. That night, Cole found a piece of wood on his cot. Scratched into it with a nail were 3 words, "Watch your back." By morning, new orders arrived, carried by a rider from the main depot. Certain detainees to be relocated. Immediate transfer at dawn. A short list followed. Mai's name was on it. When Cole saw it, his throat went dry. He understood transfers happened. But this one felt like an erasure. And as the wagons lined up under the pre-dawn flood of moonlight, he knew he'd have to decide whether to obey his orders or defy them. The wagons were already creaking when dawn cracked open the desert sky. Moonlight gave way to pale light, throwing long, ghostly shadows across the yard. The prisoners stood in rows, silent and expressionless, clutching their few possessions in burlap sacks. The sound of harnessed mules and nervous horses drowned out the morning birds. Mai was in the second row. Her name had been called 30 minutes earlier, her identity reduced to a checkmark on a ledger she wasn't allowed to see. Cole scanned the list again. 10 prisoners scheduled for transfer to the company depot in Carson City. Routine relocation, Riggs had said with a smirk. But Cole knew the pattern. The troublemakers, the outspoken, the ones who'd drawn too much attention. And Mai was on the list. She caught his gaze once as the guards began to count heads. No words, just that same quiet recognition that had formed between them weeks ago. He wanted to say something, but speech felt dangerous now. The convoy boss barked, "Move or I'm out." Boots crunched on gravel, chains rattled softly as tailgates were dropped. Each wagon took on its load of prisoners, the drivers snapping their reins in rhythm. Cole walked alongside, the ledger pressed to his chest. When Mai climbed aboard, she turned, hesitated, then did something that froze him completely. She bowed. Not a gesture of submission or fear, but of deep, formal respect. A scholar's acknowledgement of another. The nearby guards didn't notice. Cole stiffened instinctively, then returned the gesture with the smallest nod he dared risk. Mai's last glimpse of him was through the gaps in the wagon's canvas cover. Dust rose behind the convoy as it began to roll forward, sunlight bouncing off the rifle barrels one last time. Historical records show that such transfers were common, a way to break up groups and prevent organized resistance. To the prisoners, it only magnified the sense of vanishing into the vast, empty landscape. As the wagons rumbled out of the camp, Cole stood by the gate, his hat in his hand. The convoy faded into the haze, swallowed by the trail leading west. He didn't move for a long time, but his thoughts followed the wagons. He had her note, her story, folded in his pocket, and a growing suspicion that this transfer was no ordinary relocation. Because the company depot was run differently, by men who followed ledgers, not their conscience. Colder, cleaner, and far less forgiving. The company depot in Carson City didn't smell like the frontier. It smelled of coal smoke and lie. When the convoy rolled through the gates, Mai's first impression was the silence. No shouting, no chaos, just order. Whitewashed barracks stood in perfect rows, a company flag snapping in the high desert wind. Guards in matching uniforms barely glanced at the prisoners. Everything was efficient, sterile, and impersonal. A clerk with a clipboard called out names in quick, flat English. Each woman stepped forward, was assigned a number, and then guided to a designated bunk. It felt less like captivity and more like processing, like being turned into data. The Cowboys had treated them like people. The company men treated them like inventory. Mai tried to understand the new rhythm. Meals were at exact times, 6, noon, and 6. Work duties were posted daily. Even their movements between barracks were timed. The food wasn't bad, canned beans, hard bread, weak coffee, but it tasted of metal and control. The guards spoke less, smiled less. Their actions were procedural, not emotional. A cross was painted on the infirmary door, but it felt like a brand, not a promise of care. At night, Mai lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams, glinting in the moonlight. The faint sound of a saloon piano drifted from the town, a reminder of a world just beyond the fence. She missed the foreman's quiet nods, the small gestures that had felt human. Here, the guards didn't look away when the women washed. They didn't look at all. Mai learned the new rules quickly. Obey, stay invisible, forget softness. Yet part of her couldn't forget the blanket handed to her in the dust, the cigarette shared through a fence. Humanity, once tasted, couldn't be untasted. One afternoon, a notice appeared on the barrack door, typed on a machine. Mandatory delousing. All detainees. The word sent a ripple of dread through the room. The women froze, their minds flashing back to the first command at the rail camp. Shed your clothes. No one spoke. The past was looping back, and they didn't yet know if mercy had an expiration date. The order was given at dawn. All detainees to the wash house. No exceptions. Mai stood in line again, the sun just beginning to climb, baking the wooden roofs. The déjà vu was suffocating. The same posture, the same words, undress. Only this time, the guard's tone was clipped, administrative, like reading from a manual. Inside the long, rough-planked wash house, the air stung of lye soap and damp wood. A hand pump at one end fed a series of long, wooden troughs. Smoke curled from a stovepipe, hinting at the cauldrons of boiling water within. Impersonal company men moved briskly, gesturing the prisoners forward with harsh, efficient motions. No malice, no hesitation, just the hum of an indifferent system. My stomach knotted. The memory of that first moment at the rail camp, the blanket, the terror, the unexpected shame in a cowboy's eyes, rushed back. She whispered to the woman beside her, "Do you think it's the same?" The woman didn't answer. An overseer barked an order to strip and begin scrubbing in the troughs of scalding, soapy water. As Mai scrubbed her skin raw with the harsh soap, something inside her shifted. This wasn't humiliation anymore, it was processing. They weren't cleansing her as a person, but as an object, a potential source of contamination. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in the murky water, hair matted, skin red, but alive. When the order came to stop, silence fell, except for the dripping water. The guards handed out clean shifts, their faces blank, detached. Mai wrapped herself in the coarse fabric, trembling. For a fleeting second, she realized the fear had evaporated. Not because she trusted them, but because this ritual wasn't about power. It was about procedure. As the line moved toward the exit, a small, cracked mirror above a basin caught her reflection again. For the first time, she saw no prisoner, no enemy, just a survivor. But that reflection would haunt her, because soon she'd have to face what survival really meant. When the steam cleared, the mirrors told stories no one wanted to face. The room was silent except for the slow drip of water onto the wooden floorboards. Mai stood before a fogged piece of polished tin, a clean shift clutched around her shoulders, watching her own eyes emerge through the haze. They looked older, hollow, searching, almost unrecognizable. For months she'd imagined her captors as devils. Now, staring at her own reflection, she wasn't sure who the devil had been. She reached out and wiped the surface. The motion revealed a thin scar on her arm, a wound from the chaos of the raid. She remembered her old foreman telling her, pain is the price of passage, but here, pain had no purpose. It wasn't demanded, it wasn't rewarded. It just was. The women took the new clothes silently, moving with mechanical precision. Their old clothes, the symbols of their former lives, were gone, burned the night before. All that remained was the human form beneath. The transformation was quiet but profound. Later, company health reports would record measurable changes, weight gained, disease nearly eliminated. Yet no statistic could capture what was happening inside these women's minds. The enemy's impersonal efficiency was dismantling their faith in everything they'd been taught. Mai found herself helping the weakest among them, holding hands, sharing rations, whispering comfort. Empathy, once seen as a weakness, now felt like rebellion. They clean our bodies, she murmured one night, and somehow, they clean our hatred, too. The camp routines became her new clock. Morning roll call, meals, work details. The guards remained distant but predictable, and predictability was a strange kind of safety. For the first time, sleep came without nightmares. One evening, as the sun bled across the Sierra Nevada, she stood near the wire fence and caught sight of a rider arriving with a telegram. The wharf between the railroad companies, it seemed, was ending somewhere she couldn't see. Whispers spread among the prisoners, a merger, a buyout, new lines drawn on a map in an office thousands of miles away. That night, Mai returned to the mirror. The same face stared back. But this time, there was no fear, no disbelief, just waiting. She didn't know it yet, but the next sound she'd hear would not be gunfire. It would be the opening of a gate. The announcement came not with a gunshot or a bugle, but from a foreman reading a telegram from a wooden crate. Midday, late in the summer of 1889. The depot stood still under the burning sun as the man cleared his throat, his voice barely louder than the wind. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific have reached an accord. All disputes are settled. All contract labor is to be released. For a moment, no one moved. The words hung in the dry air like dust after a rock slide. The Chinese women froze in place, hands still mid-task, laundry buckets half-dipped, spoons paused over tin plates. No cheering, no collapse, just a silence so complete that even the mules seemed to stop twitching their ears. Mai's breath caught. She'd imagined this day 1,000 ways, escape, vengeance, being sold to another company. But this, a single voice declaring the end of everything, felt unreal. Around her, the women stared at one another as if waiting for someone to interpret the meaning. The company guards didn't celebrate either. They simply removed their hats and stood in the stillness. Even they seemed to sense that this wasn't victory, it was a business transaction. The world they'd fought to control had been consolidated, and yet no one looked triumphant. Mai sank to her knees, not from grief, but from confusion. If being freed wasn't a victory, what was it? She remembered the mirror, the blanket, the cigarette, the small mercies that had redefined her idea of the enemy and of honor. Maybe this moment wasn't defeat or victory, but simply release. Nearby, a guard lowered the company flag, a gesture that made the women whisper. Was it respect for them? For the dead? For everyone who hadn't survived long enough to hear the foreman read his telegram? A few women began to cry softly, almost politely. Another followed, but Mai stayed still, her face dry, her heart strangely calm. For the first time, she thought, we are all just workers. The guards began to walk the perimeter again, but slower now, as if unsure what came next. The railroad war had ended, but the camp gates didn't swing open immediately. Because peace, she realized, doesn't arrive like a train. It arrives with waiting. The locomotive was loud when the train left Nevada. Rows of Chinese women sat on hard wooden benches, their company-issued coats pulled tight, watching the desert shrink into a blur of brown and gray. The conflict was over, but the air still carried its taste, coal smoke, dust, and memory. Mai leaned against the window, a small canvas bag at her feet. Inside, a change of clothes, a comb, and nothing else. The company had given them back their freedom, but freedom didn't feel familiar anymore. For days, the train rattled east, cutting across an invisible map of toil and ambition. Each sunrise painted the carriage in golden light, and each evening the women gathered quietly, staring toward a home they couldn't picture anymore. The guards on board treated them well enough, polite distance, measured respect, but no one spoke much. It was as if everyone understood that words might break the fragile silence holding their new world together. Mai kept thinking of the mirror, the blanket, the note she'd written, the one Cole had kept. She wondered if he was still out there, or if his conscience had cost him his job. There was no way to know. All that remained were fragments, moments of decency in a life built on cruelty. When the crowded skyline of San Francisco finally appeared, a smudge of gray through the fog, no one cheered. Some women cried quietly, others just stared. The docks were crowded with officials, missionaries, and silent men from the 6 companies. The city beyond was a chaotic maze, an empire of wood and brick where the air smelled of salt, fish, and smoke, the scent of a new struggle. Over the years, tens of thousands of Chinese laborers would be caught in the churn of America's expansion. Home, for most, no longer existed in the same way. What waited was hardship, prejudice, and uncertainty. As Mai stepped off the train, she clutched her bag tighter. A child offered her a piece of candied ginger through the crowd, his eyes wide and curious. She bowed, tears burning her eyes. Kindness again, from a stranger, just when she thought she'd forgotten what it looked like. That night, in a crowded boarding house, she unpacked her few belongings. At the bottom of the bag, folded and worn, was a scrap of paper the guards had missed, the unfinished note she thought was gone. It was waiting for an ending. Years passed before anyone opened the envelope again. By then, the paper had yellowed, the ink faded, but Mai's characters were still graceful, disciplined, even in sorrow. She'd hidden the note for decades, folded into the lining of an old padded jacket she refused to throw away. Time moved on. San Francisco rebuilt itself after the fire, a new city on the ashes of the old. But every spring, when the fog rolled in from the bay, she'd find herself touching that hidden pocket, remembering the day she first wrote those words. In 1952, long after her death, her granddaughter donated the jacket to a small historical society. The archivist almost missed it. The paper was tucked deep inside, fragile as a dried leaf. When unfolded, the first line read, "To the man who showed me honor when the world had forgotten it." The note was dated 1888. No surname, just Mai. The letter described the desert camp, the blanket, the shared tobacco, the transfer. It wasn't a love letter, it was a record of transformation. "I believed we were told to endure with silence," it read. "But you taught me there is strength in letting others see your soul." Curators traced the details, the name of the railroad subcontractor, the location of the camp, and found a matching name in old company logs. Foreman Cole Tanner, discharged in 1894 insubordination. Among his effects, donated by his grandnephew decades later, was a small, worn leather pouch. Inside, a folded piece of paper written in Chinese characters, translated clumsily on the back in pencil. The same phrases, the same hand, two notes, two sides of the same frontier, preserved a continent apart. The historian who discovered them wrote, it wasn't a treaty that ended their hatred. It was small decencies. The documents became part of an exhibit titled Kindness in a Cruel Land. Visitors would stop in front of the display, reading her words beneath the dim museum lights. No rifles, no company flags, just handwriting and silence. In the final line, Mai had written, if this note survives, let it tell the truth. The enemy I feared most was my own heart. Her granddaughter stood before that glass case on opening day, eyes wet, whispering her name. Outside, rain tapped against the museum windows, soft and persistent, like the echo of a train engine fading into the fog. The railroad wars had ended 70 years earlier, but her words were still traveling.